The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. 23 years he had served the crown, and never once had he questioned an order. Today, however, something felt different in the air. Thomas had been assigned to the Queen's personal security detail for the past 5 years, a position that came with both honor and heartbreak. He had watched Her Majesty grow frailer with each passing season, yet her spirit remained as sharp as ever. The bond between the Queen and her beloved Corgis had always fascinated him. Those little dogs seemed to understand her moods better than most humans ever could. The news had reached the palace staff just 3 days ago. The Queen had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. The entire nation mourned, but nowhere was the grief felt more deeply than within these palace walls. Thomas had served many members of the royal family, but the Queen held a special place in his heart. She had personally commended him twice for his dedication and had even asked about his family during quiet moments. Now, as the palace prepared for the transition of power, everything seemed to move in a strange, mechanical rhythm. King Charles had officially taken the throne, and Queen Camilla was settling into her new role. The staff whispered among themselves about the changes that might come, but Thomas tried to focus on his duties. The Queen's Corgis had become a particular concern for everyone. Muick and Sandy, the 2 remaining dogs, seemed lost without their beloved mistress. They wandered the halls with confusion in their eyes, waiting at doors that would never open for them again. The sight broke Thomas's heart every time he encountered them during his rounds. Thomas had grown quite attached to these dogs over the years. During his shifts guarding the Queen's quarters, he often found himself in quiet conversation with them. Muick, the younger of the 2, had a playful spirit that reminded Thomas of his own childhood dog. Sandy, older and more reserved, carried herself with a dignity that seemed to mirror the Queen herself. The staff had been informed that arrangements were being made for the Corgis' care. Prince Andrew and his daughters had expressed interest in taking them, which seemed fitting since they had originally gifted the dogs to the Queen. Thomas felt relieved knowing they would go to family members who understood their importance. On this particular morning, Thomas was assigned to patrol the East Wing when he noticed unusual activity near the Queen's former private apartments. Several staff members were moving boxes and personal items, preparing the space for whatever changes lay ahead. The sight of the Queen's belongings being packed away struck him with unexpected emotion. As he turned a corner, Thomas nearly bumped into Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for nearly as long as he had. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a tissue in her weathered hands. "Oh, Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." "No need to apologize, Mrs. Henderson. These are difficult days for all of us," Thomas replied gently. He had always respected the woman's dedication to the royal household. "Indeed they are," she nodded. 27 years I've been caring for Her Majesty's quarters, and now—" She gestured helplessly toward the rooms behind her. "It doesn't feel real, does it?" Thomas shook his head. "No, it doesn't. But we must carry on as she would have wanted us to." Mrs. Henderson managed a weak smile. "You're right, of course. She always said the work must continue." She paused, then added quietly, "I do worry about those poor dogs, though. They keep returning to her sitting room, waiting for her to call them for their afternoon walk." The mention of the Corgis made Thomas's chest tighten. He had seen them himself, sitting by the Queen's favorite chair with expressions that could only be described as hopeful confusion. "I'm sure the arrangements being made will be suitable," he said, though something in his voice suggested uncertainty. "Yes, I'm sure you're right," Mrs. Henderson replied, though she didn't sound entirely convinced either. "Well, I must get back to my duties. Good day, Sergeant." As she walked away, Thomas continued his patrol with a heavy heart. The palace felt different now, as if some essential warmth had been drained from its walls. The Queen's presence had been more than just ceremonial. She had been the beating heart of this place, and without her, everyone seemed to be struggling to find their rhythm. Later that afternoon, Thomas was stationed outside the main entrance when he saw Queen Camilla's car approaching. She had been in and out of the palace frequently since the Queen's passing, attending to various matters related to her new role. Thomas straightened his posture and prepared to offer the customary salute. As the car pulled up, Thomas noticed something unusual. Queen Camilla emerged from the vehicle carrying what appeared to be a small pet carrier. His trained eye immediately recognized the anxious whimpering coming from within. One of the Queen's Corgis was inside that carrier. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, though he couldn't quite explain why. Something about the scene struck him as wrong, but he maintained his professional composure as Queen Camilla approached the entrance. She nodded briefly in his direction before disappearing into the palace. The rest of Thomas's shift passed uneventfully, but he couldn't shake the image of that pet carrier from his mind. Throughout the evening, he found himself wondering which of the Corgis had been inside and where Queen Camilla might have been taking it. The arrangements for the dog's care weren't supposed to be finalized for several more days, according to the information he had received. That night, as Thomas prepared to leave the palace after his shift, he encountered one of the junior staff members who worked in the royal quarters. The young man looked troubled, and when Thomas asked if everything was all right, the response only deepened his concern. "It's probably nothing, Sergeant," the young man said hesitantly. "But I was helping to organize some of the Queen's personal effects today, and I couldn't help but notice that only one of the Corgis was in the usual area. Muick was there, but I didn't see Sandy anywhere." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Perhaps she was being walked or groomed," he suggested, though the explanation felt hollow. "Maybe," the young man replied, but his expression suggested he harbored the same doubts that were now forming in Thomas's mind. As Thomas made his way home that evening, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The Queen had loved those dogs more than most people loved their children. They had been her constant companions, her source of comfort during difficult times, and her daily reminder of the simple joys in life. The thought of them being separated or, worse, sent away to some unknown fate, made Thomas feel physically ill. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and all it represented. But what did that mean when the crown itself seemed to be changing in ways that went against everything the late Queen had stood for? That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind. The image of that pet carrier haunted him, along with the memory of Sandy's trusting brown eyes. He had served the royal family faithfully for over 2 decades, never questioning orders or challenging authority. But as he drifted off to sleep, Thomas found himself wondering if loyalty to the crown might sometimes require standing against those who wore it. The next morning would bring answers to his questions, though not the ones he hoped to hear, and those answers would force Thomas Mitchell to make a choice that would define not just his career, but his character as a human being. In the quiet darkness of his modest flat, Thomas made a silent promise to the memory of his beloved Queen. Whatever was happening to her precious Corgis, he would not stand idly by and let it continue. Some things, he realized, were more important than following orders blindly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Thomas believed about duty, honor, and doing what was right, even when it came at a personal cost. The next morning arrived gray and drizzle-soaked, matching Thomas's mood perfectly. He had barely slept, his mind churning with worry about Sandy and what he had witnessed the previous day. As he dressed in his uniform, each familiar motion felt heavier than usual, weighted down by the knowledge that today might change everything. Thomas arrived at the palace earlier than required, hoping to gather more information about what had happened to the missing Corgi. He made his way through the staff corridors, greeting colleagues with his usual professional manner while keeping his ears open for any mention of the dogs. His first stop was the palace kitchen, where he often chatted with the staff during quiet moments. Mrs. Davies, the assistant cook who had always been fond of the Queen's corgis, looked up from her morning preparations with a sad smile. "Morning, Sergeant Mitchell. Terrible business, all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the palace around them. "Indeed it is, Mrs. Davies. I don't suppose you've seen either of the Queen's corgis this morning?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Mrs. Davies's expression grew troubled. "Well, that's the strange thing. I've only seen Muck. Poor little fellow came looking for his breakfast as usual, but Sandy wasn't with him. First time I can remember them being separated for a meal." Thomas felt his suspicions solidifying into cold certainty. "Perhaps she's being cared for elsewhere in the palace?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Davies replied, but her tone suggested she shared his doubts. "Though it does seem odd, doesn't it? Those two have been inseparable since they arrived here." As Thomas continued his morning rounds, he made discreet inquiries with other staff members. The picture that emerged confirmed his worst fears. Sandy had indeed been taken away the previous afternoon, and no one seemed to know where or why. The official story, when anyone bothered to give one, was vague and unsatisfying. By mid-morning, Thomas had positioned himself strategically near the main administrative offices, hoping to overhear something that might shed light on the situation. His patience was rewarded when he caught sight of Queen Camilla's private secretary, a stern woman named Ms. Whitmore, speaking quietly on her mobile phone. "Yes, the arrangement has been made as requested," Ms. Whitmore was saying. "The animal has been delivered to the facility, and they understand the need for discretion. No, there won't be any public announcement. This is being handled as a private family matter." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The clinical way she referred to Sandy as the animal, and the mention of a facility, painted a picture he didn't want to believe. But the evidence was mounting, and his protective instincts were screaming that something terrible was happening. The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness as Thomas struggled to maintain his professional composure while his mind raced with possibilities. He considered his options carefully. As a royal guard, he had very limited authority to question the decisions of the royal family. But as a human being who had witnessed the Queen's love for these animals, he felt a moral obligation to act. Around noon, Thomas was assigned to duty near the Queen Consort's private offices. It was then that fate presented him with the opportunity he had been both hoping for and dreading. Queen Camilla emerged from her office carrying another pet carrier, and through the mesh, Thomas could see Muick's distinctive markings. The sight hit Thomas like a physical blow. First Sandy, and now Muick. Whatever was happening, it was clear that both of the Queen's beloved companions were being removed from the palace, and from the sounds of it, they weren't going to live with Prince Andrew as originally planned. Thomas watched as Queen Camilla approached the main entrance, clearly intending to take Muick to the same unknown destination as his companion. The little dog's whimpers from inside the carrier echoed through the corridor, a sound that seemed to pierce straight through Thomas's professional restraint. As Queen Camilla reached the entrance, she paused and looked directly at Thomas. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to his complete shock, she extended the pet carrier toward him. "Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it?" she said in a tone that was both casual and commanding. "I need you to take this to my car and ensure it's properly secured for transport." Thomas stared at the carrier being offered to him, his mind reeling. Inside, Muick continued to whimper, and Thomas could see the confusion and fear in the little dog's eyes through the mesh. This was the moment he had been dreading and preparing for all morning. "Ma'am," Thomas said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, "may I inquire about the destination for this animal?" Queen Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly at the question. I beg your pardon, Sergeant? Thomas felt his heart pounding, but he held his ground. The Queen's Corgis, ma'am. The staff has been concerned about their welfare following Her late Majesty's passing. We were under the impression that arrangements had been made for them to remain within the royal family. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop several degrees. Queen Camilla's expression shifted from mild surprise to something much colder. Sergeant Mitchell, I don't believe the disposition of these animals is any concern of yours. You have been given a direct instruction. Thomas looked down at Muke, who was now pressing his nose against the mesh of the carrier, seeming to recognize him from their encounters in the Queen's quarters. The little dog's trust was heartbreaking, and Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside him. With respect, ma'am, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. I cannot in good conscience assist in removing this animal from the palace without knowing that his welfare will be properly maintained. The silence that followed felt eternal. Other staff members in the vicinity had stopped their activities, sensing the tension in the air but not quite understanding what was happening. Queen Camilla's face had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on Thomas with laser intensity. Sergeant Mitchell, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of royal authority. You are refusing a direct order from your queen consort? Thomas felt the weight of 23 years of faithful service pressing down on him. Every instinct trained into him screamed to obey, to take the carrier and ask no questions. But stronger than that training was the memory of the late Queen's gentle hands stroking these same dogs, of her voice softening whenever she spoke to them, of the pure joy that had lit up her face during their daily walks. Ma'am, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say, I swore an oath to serve the crown and protect what it represents. These animals were beloved by Her late Majesty, and I believe that protecting them is part of that oath. The corridor had gone completely silent now. Even the usual background noises of palace life seemed to have stopped. Queen Camilla's expression was unreadable, but Thomas could sense the fury building beneath her composed exterior. I see, she said finally, her voice dangerously quiet. And you believe you are better positioned than I am to determine what is best for these animals? I believe, ma'am, that the Queen's wishes regarding their care should be honored, Thomas replied. And those wishes were that they should remain with family members who understood their importance to her. Queen Camilla set the carrier down abruptly, the sudden motion causing Muke to yelp in fear. Thomas instinctively stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding all protocol. Do not, Queen Camilla said sharply. Take another step toward that carrier, Sergeant Mitchell. Thomas froze, but his eyes remained fixed on Muke, who had gone quiet but was clearly terrified. The little dog seemed to sense the tension in the air, and his whole body was trembling. Ma'am, Thomas said, making one final attempt at diplomacy. Perhaps we could contact Prince Andrew's office to confirm the arrangements. I'm sure there's simply been some miscommunication. Queen Camilla's laugh was cold and brittle. There has been no miscommunication, Sergeant. The arrangements I have made are final, and they are none of your concern. Thomas felt the last of his diplomatic options slipping away. He thought of Sandy, already gone to whatever fate awaited her, and of Muke, trembling in his carrier. He thought of the Queen, who had entrusted him not just with her physical safety, but with protecting the things she held dear. Then I'm afraid I cannot comply with your request, ma'am, Thomas said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left his mouth. The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Thomas knew that his career was likely over, that he was challenging the authority of someone who now held immense power over his future. But looking at Muke's frightened eyes, he also knew that he could live with the consequences of standing up for what was right far better than he could live with the knowledge that he had helped facilitate something wrong. Queen Camilla stared at him for a long moment, her face a mask of controlled rage. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving the pet carrier sitting on the floor between them. Thomas looked down at Muick, who was now pressing against the front of the carrier as if trying to get closer to the only familiar face in this frightening situation. The little dog's trust was both heartbreaking and empowering. As Thomas knelt down to comfort the frightened animal, he realized that the easy part was over. Now came the real challenge, figuring out how to protect these innocent creatures from whatever plans had been made for them and dealing with the inevitable consequences of his defiance. The battle lines had been drawn, and Thomas Mitchell, royal guard and protector of the crown's true values, had chosen his side. In the tense silence that followed Queen Camilla's departure, Thomas found himself alone in the corridor with Muick's carrier. The little Corgi was still trembling, pressing his nose through the mesh toward Thomas's outstretched hand. The familiar warmth of the dog's trust gave Thomas strength, even as he realized the magnitude of what he had just done. Word of the confrontation spread through the palace with the speed that only gossip among close-knit staff could achieve. Within an hour, Thomas received a summons to report to his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, a man he had served under for the past 8 years and respected greatly. Captain Reynolds's office felt smaller than usual as Thomas stood at attention, waiting for what he assumed would be his dismissal. The older man studied Thomas's service record spread across his desk, occasionally glancing up with an expression that was difficult to read. 23 years of exemplary service, Captain Reynolds said finally. Not a single mark against your record, multiple commendations, personal recognition from Her late Majesty herself. He leaned back in his chair. And now this. Thomas remained silent, knowing that anything he said could only make matters worse. Captain Reynolds continued to study him, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out across his superior's weathered features. "Thomas," the captain said, dropping the formal tone, "help me understand what happened down there. Because what I'm hearing doesn't sound like the man I've known for 8 years. Thomas took a careful breath before responding. "Sir, I witnessed what I believe to be a potential threat to the welfare of animals that were precious to our late queen. I felt duty-bound to intervene." "A potential threat," Captain Reynolds repeated slowly. "From the queen consort herself?" "Yes, sir." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Captain Reynolds stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. "Thomas, do you have any idea what you've put me in the position of having to do?" "Yes, sir. I expect my dismissal and possible criminal charges for insubordination." Captain Reynolds turned back to face him, and Thomas was surprised to see something that looked almost like admiration in the older man's eyes. "The thing is, Thomas, you've also put me in the position of having to investigate your claims. Because if you're right, if there was indeed a threat to those animals, then your actions weren't insubordination. They were exactly what we're trained to do." Thomas felt a flicker of hope, though he tried not to let it show on his face. Captain Reynolds returned to his desk and picked up the phone. "Mrs. Henderson? Captain Reynolds here. I need you to come to my office immediately and bring with you any information you have about the arrangements made for Her late Majesty's corgis." He paused, listening. "Yes, I know it's an unusual request. Please come anyway." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Henderson sat nervously in Captain Reynolds's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Thomas remained standing at attention, though the captain had given him permission to sit. "Mrs. Henderson," Captain Reynolds began gently, "we need to understand exactly what arrangements were made for the Queen's corgis after her passing." The elderly housekeeper looked between the two men uncertainly. "Well, sir, the original plan was for them to go to Prince Andrew and his daughters. Her Majesty had discussed this arrangement several times, and the prince had agreed enthusiastically." "The original plan," Captain Reynolds noted. Has that plan changed? Mrs. Henderson's discomfort was obvious. I believe there may have been some adjustments made, sir. What kind of adjustments? I'm not entirely certain, sir, but yesterday one of the dogs was taken away, and today— She glanced at Thomas. Well, today the sergeant prevented the second one from being removed. Captain Reynolds leaned forward. Taken away to where, Mrs. Henderson? I don't know, sir. None of the usual staff were involved in the arrangements. Everything was handled through the Queen Consort's private office. Thomas watched as Captain Reynolds processed this information. The older man's expression was growing increasingly troubled. Mrs. Henderson, in your professional opinion, were these arrangements consistent with what you understood to be the late Queen's wishes? The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. No, sir, they were not. Her Majesty loved those dogs like children. She would never have wanted them to be. She couldn't finish the sentence. Captain Reynolds dismissed Mrs. Henderson with instructions to keep their conversation confidential, then spent several long minutes in thoughtful silence. Finally, he picked up his phone again. I need to speak with Prince Andrew's office, he said to whoever answered. Yes, it's urgent. The conversation that followed was brief, but illuminating. When Captain Reynolds hung up, his expression was grim. Prince Andrew's office confirms that no arrangements have been made to transfer the Corgis to his care, he told Thomas. In fact, they were surprised by my call, as they had been expecting contact about finalizing the arrangements, but had heard nothing. Thomas felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. So where was Sandy taken? Sir, that's exactly what we're going to find out. Captain Reynolds stood up decisively. Thomas, I'm temporarily suspending you from active duty pending investigation, but I want you to remain available, and I want you to say nothing to anyone about this conversation. Thomas nodded, understanding that his suspension was more protective than punitive. Over the next 3 days, Captain Reynolds conducted a quiet but thorough investigation. What he discovered horrified him. Through careful inquiries and the cooperation of several concerned staff members, he learned that Queen Camilla had indeed made arrangements for both Corgis to be euthanized at a private veterinary facility. Her justification, according to her private secretary, was that the dogs were a painful reminder of the previous regime and that their presence in the palace was inappropriate for the new era. The veterinary facility had been chosen for its discretion and its willingness to ask no questions about the decision. Sandy had already been put down by the time Captain Reynolds learned the truth. Muick's life had been saved only by Thomas's intervention. Armed with this information, Captain Reynolds made the difficult decision to bypass normal channels and contact Prince Andrew directly. The prince's reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, he had arrived at the palace, accompanied by his daughters Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, all of them demanding answers and immediate custody of Muick. The confrontation between Prince Andrew and Queen Camilla was brief but decisive. Faced with the prospect of public exposure of what she had done, and the united opposition of other senior members of the royal family, Queen Camilla had little choice but to agree to transfer Muick immediately to Prince Andrew's care. The veterinary facility was contacted and threatened with exposure and legal action if any harm came to other animals in similar circumstances. While it was too late to save Sandy, the threat of scandal ensured that such arrangements would not be made again. Thomas was quietly reinstated to his position with a formal commendation for upholding the highest traditions of service and protection. Captain Reynolds made sure that the commendation specifically mentioned his defense of vulnerable beings entrusted to royal care. 2 weeks later, Thomas received an unexpected visitor during his off-duty hours. Prince Andrew, casually dressed and without any formal protocol, appeared at Thomas's modest flat with a surprise. I thought you might like to see how Muick is settling in, the prince said with a warm smile. There, on a lead held by Princess Eugenie, was Muck himself. The little Corgi looked transformed from the frightened animal Thomas had last seen in the carrier. His tail was wagging, his eyes were bright, and he appeared to be thriving in his new home. When Muick saw Thomas, he immediately strained toward the guard, clearly remembering their connection. Thomas knelt down to greet the dog, feeling a profound sense of relief and satisfaction. "We can never thank you enough," Princess Beatrice said quietly. "Grandmother would have been heartbroken to know what nearly happened to them." "We've also established a small memorial garden for Sandy at our estate," Prince Andrew added. "We thought you might like to visit sometime." As Thomas watched Muick play happily in his small garden, he reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. His career could have been over, his life derailed by a single moment of defiance. But sometimes, he realized, doing what was right required risking everything. The palace had changed since the Queen's passing, and not all of those changes sat well with Thomas. But he had learned that his true loyalty was not to any individual wearing a crown, but to the principles and values that the crown was supposed to represent. Standing in his garden, watching a rescued Corgi chase butterflies while being doted on by people who truly cared for him, Thomas felt at peace with his choice. He had honored his oath to protect what the Queen held dear, and in doing so, he had discovered something valuable about himself. Some battles, he had learned, were worth fighting regardless of the cost. And sometimes, standing against authority was the highest form of service one could offer. The late Queen would have understood, Thomas thought as he scratched behind Muick's ears one more time before the royal visitors departed. She had always valued courage and compassion above blind obedience. In the years that followed, Thomas continued his service with renewed purpose, always remembering that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to say no. And whenever he saw Muick during his occasional visits to the palace with Prince Andrew's family, the little dog's joyful greeting reminded him that he had made the right choice. The crown would endure, as it always had. But it would be stronger for having servants who understood that protecting what was good and innocent was more important than following orders without question. Thomas had honored both his queen and himself by choosing conscience over compliance. The story became a quiet legend among the palace staff, passed down as an example of what it truly meant to serve with honor. And in the memorial garden where Sandy was remembered, a small plaque bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of what Thomas had learned. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it.